there's a second agency that has drawn the ire of the Trump administration, and this is the NIH. The National Institute of Health is a part of HHS. They are pretty crucial to medical research, cancer research, all of which is funded through taxpayer dollars. This article is courtesy of Politico. This, however, focuses on the red states and the red state universities who are against this, because this is cutting funding for the NIH is bad in two ways. One, you are on the side of disease at that point. If you cut funding to the NIH, you are pro disease. You're pro polio, you're pro measles, but it's also going to lay off countless numbers of employees who work at these universities. And I'm not just talking about the researchers and the scientists, it's the maintenance staff, it's the custodial staff. It's so many people that it's not just the people who research medicine, but the people who help maintain the labs and the buildings and all of the people who work the administrative roles. Red state universities are hitting back at the Trump administration's expansive cuts to science and research funding, warning that they would be forced to shutter laboratories and lay off staff should they face the sudden elimination of millions of dollars in funding. The blowback, echoed by at least two Republican senators, marks the most widespread political resistance the Trump administration has faced in its rapid sprint to reshape the federal government and its spending. The administration has framed its blanket cap on the NIH funding for research-related administrative costs as reining in elite coastal institutions like Harvard and Yale, which it argues has vacuumed up too much taxpayer money. As if Harvard and Yale are the only two universities that participate in this. J.D. Vance, Yale graduate, by the way. There are public universities in every state that benefit from NIH funding. And forget the libtard centers of New York and California. In Alabama, the second largest employer in the state of Alabama is the University of Alabama, Birmingham, which employs 30,000 people. And a non-minuscule amount of them would be laid off as a result of this funding freeze. Yet in a flurry of lawsuits and dire pleas, universities in ruby red states like Alabama and Kentucky warned that the cuts could be devastating to public institutions that are widely regarded as economic engines in their regions. This is very similar to the Department of Education discussion. We did a story on a school in Bell County, Kentucky that is almost entirely reliant on the Department of Education funding to keep their school up and running. When you take away federal funding, you further harm the most marginalized and impoverished people in the country. A large portion of these folks who voted for Donald Trump, who voted for the Republican Party. So don't fucking sit here and tell me that these people knew what they were voting for. Did some people do it and vote against their best interest? Yeah, there are always people that like that vote like that. But I would guarantee a large portion of people who voted for Trump this time did not expect him to take an axe to the administrative state. I mean, you can call them naive, and I would probably call them naive because he did talk about it. But there's no reason for this to be going on. Quote, this change isn't a cost savings, it's a cost transfer. Jeffrey Gold, president of the University of Nebraska system, wrote in a letter to students and faculty predicting the policy would shrink its research capabilities and force the state to fill the funding gap. States, red states in particular, cannot fund themselves. these states do not generate enough tax revenue to fund the public institutions. Red states are subsidized by the blue states. Blue states like California, New York, Massachusetts. When we pay federal tax dollars, we give out more to the red states than we receive back. I'm totally fine with this system. I've been on record multiple times saying that we are an economic union. We are the United States of America. It is the federal government's job to provide federal tax dollars to the people who need them most, which is why I get really fucking pissed off when these kinds of flagrantly illogical cuts are talked about, because it's only going to hurt people who work in these communities, but also people who receive medical care in these communities. The growing pushback comes as lawmakers and higher education officials scramble to decode a directive that stood to slash an estimated $4 billion in spending with almost no warning and little explanation. A new White House official could not say why the administration chose to set the NIH's set limit at 15% of indirect research costs, underscoring the rushed process behind a policy that the administration rolled out just 48 hours before it was set to take effect. This is in line with the recklessness of the federal funding freeze at large. These agencies, these groups, don't have any contingency plans in this regard. If you were going to do something as fucking stupid as this, you would have to give 6 months notice, so that way universities would be able to find alternative funding methods. Maybe they reach out for fundraising, they seek a larger endowment from alumni or whatever it may be. But this only makes the process worse when you have such a blatant disregard for the institutions that are going to be affected. Now, I want to just touch on indirect research costs. This is categorized as overhead expenses, which it more plainly means administrative costs. So I mentioned the custodial staff before. Maintenance and janitorial is an indirect expense in this instance because the janitors are not contributing to medical research directly, but they play a crucial role in the operation of these labs. It's also managers, receptionists, I guess you could throw in there, people who do all of the ordering for the various medical materials. That is what would be affected by this reduced cap on indirect funding. Additionally, bringing that down means that the researchers have an inadequate environment to conduct research. The change, which would cut overall spending by an estimated $4 billion, was ordered by DOJ, not staffers within the agency, the official confirmed. Keep in mind, $4 billion in the grand scope of the federal government is not that much. The United States government is absolutely enormous. It is a multi-trillion-dollar operation. The United States government has a budget that is larger than the GDP of several highly industrialized nations. That is because we have a massive population. And it requires money to not only contribute to Medicare and Medicaid, but also, again, the other various agencies that help keep us safe. Additionally, mind you, $800 billion is the military budget. I'm rounding up. It's like 770 or whatever. We are on track to have a $1 trillion military, which, unlike other government institutions, doesn't have to scale as the population increases. The United States military has a larger budget than virtually every other military combined. China and India, countries with sizably bigger populations than the United States, have their military operate with like half the budget, perhaps even more. China, I think there's like 500 billion between the US and China when it comes to military operating expenses. That's where all of the bloat is. It's not at fucking University of Alabama Tuscaloosa. It's not at Iowa State University. A federal judge in Massachusetts put a temporary nationwide hold on the funding cuts Monday, but the initiative represents the biggest weapon deployed so far in the Trump administration's broader assault on higher education, an industry that has been a longtime target of conservatives who have accused universities of fostering progressive ideologies. This is farcical. It's not that universities have progressive ideology. It's just that universities are very diverse. You have a lot of different kinds of people meeting at universities. You have young people, you have older folks, black, brown, Mexican, Honduran, from transfers from Africa, Asia, gay, lesbian, trans. It doesn't matter. It's diverse. And when young people are put in a diverse environment, they usually tend to be a little bit more progressive. Not only that, depending on what classes you take, like history, for example, history isn't necessarily progressive, but you do learn. I don't want to say you learn like left wing history, but you are given the full context of historical events, and you may grow and you may tend to think a little bit more liberally. But you could still, like, the idea that conservatives don't exist on college campuses is just, it's just silly. The nation's administrative crackdown on diversity, education, and inclusion initiatives has had an additional chilling effect on university programs. Last week, Trump fired the boards of the U.S. military service academies and said Elon Musk's Doge had the Department of Education in its crosshairs, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's former action on behalf of student loan borrowers is set to end amid Trump's orders to halt work at the agency. Contrary to the hysteria, this is a quote, by the way, redirecting billions of allocated NIH spending away from administrative bloat means there will be more money and resources available for legitimate scientific research, not less, said White House spokesperson Kush Desai. Quote, the Trump administration is committed to slashing the cottage industry built off of the waste, fraud, and abuse within our mammoth government while prioritizing the needs of everyday Americans. Tell me, if you have fewer money, if you have fewer dollars to conduct research, how can you allocate those resources to more research? The math does not math, guys. This is just a fucking lie. You can't do more legitimate funding with less money. That's not how this works. It's this whole like corporate thinking where the fewer employees you have and the more money you can generate makes you more efficient. But they're refusing to understand that corporations and big companies do not innovate. In the business world, entrepreneurs innovate and individuals innovate. Corporations do not, because it's risky and it frightens the investors. They don't want to risk out on a new product flopping. This is even more insidious because you're playing with the physical well-being of so many Americans. When you think about access to healthcare in this country, as shit as it may be, a lot of people rely on universities associated or on hospitals associated with universities. I get my healthcare from an NYU affiliate. I'm lucky that I live in the state of New York and I really don't have to worry about healthcare. But again, I'm lucky. I'm privileged in this regard. And I understand that there are a lot of folks in rural America who don't have that same luxury. And the only quality healthcare that they can receive is from the University of Nebraska or Alabama or Oklahoma. Trump's allies acknowledged there were no studies or clear evidence. Oh my God. I know I said previously that I wish that they would just be more open about things, but every time they are, I just can't help but laugh because it sounds so fucking dumb. They are literally the dumbest motherfuckers on the planet. They acknowledge that there were no studies or clear evidence for setting the NIH's funding limit at 15%, but express support for the overall goal of cutting payments to an academic world they believe has veered too far left. The NIH currently negotiates its rates with individual schools, a process mandated by Congress after rejecting President Donald Trump's attempt to set a 10% rate in his first term. If you think that colleges are inherently left wing, I don't know what to tell you. There's no way to tap into like any part of your brain. It's not necessarily how conservative a college is or not. It's about the wide array of information that the student has access to. Because there are Christian universities. Are you fucking kidding me? There are universities that could be perceived as right wing, like Liberty University, universities that force all of their students to attend church or to take theology classes. Like, that's not an issue for conservatives for whatever reason, because obviously that aligns with them. But they're just weaponizing government agencies, much in the same way that they criticize Joe Biden for doing the same. They're literally doing it, but in reverse. Quote, it's possible that this is an opening bid in a negotiation, said Jay Green, a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, who has criticized schools for treating the money as a slush fund and noted some private organizations like the Gates Foundation set 15% limits for their indirect costs. Here's the thing. We'll take vaccines as the example. Private companies do not do research and development for vaccines. The Gates Foundation is not conducting research on the mRNA vaccine. All of that is entirely taxpayer funded, and its research is government sanctioned. When the COVID vaccine came around, yeah, you guessed it, scientists were using grants awarded to them by the government. After that point, it's in the hands of these private companies, but the funding and the research is all courtesy of the government and the taxpayer. The Gates Foundation is not the humanitarian, it's not the giver of humanitarian aid that you may think it is. Because at the end of the day, it's all philanthropy, and they're not beholden to anything. The government at least has an interest in keeping its fucking population alive. I mean, even if you're a capitalist, like, you would want that because you want a healthier workforce that could work longer for you. The broader point of the directive, he argued, was to remind academics, quote, what might happen if they piss off enough people? What'll happen to all the money they depend on? This isn't the end of universities. It's just kind of a rebalancing of their priorities and interests. This is so fucking disgusting. These people are such ghouls. I hate them. I hate them. I hate them. It's not about the university, you fucking cocksucker. It's about the people who rely on these universities for healthcare and for their fucking job. Are you dumb? No, you're just an out of touch asshole. What'll happen to the money they depend on? Well, if you live in a red state, like, imagine this fucking dickhead lived in Louisiana. What if New York and California just stopped wanting to pay federal taxes? Oh, what if they pulled the same thing? They would screech about how ridiculous it is, or maybe they wouldn't because they're just like that fucking stupid. But you shouldn't be using this as a bargaining chip. You should want to foster higher education. You should want to expose young minds to as many different points of view as possible, so that way they could come to a competent understanding of the world that they live in. But Republicans don't want that. They don't want an educated workforce because an educated workforce is harder to divide along class lines, which is exactly what neoliberalism has tried to do and successfully done over 50 years. If you don't have a proper understanding of the history of this country, you won't understand, it won't click for you that the reason why your life sucks and that the reason why life historically has been shitty is because you have these hyper wealthy assholes who want to hoard all the money and then lie to you and say the reason that you suck and your life sucks is because of the one trans person that you know, or because of the elderly people from Costa Rica that immigrated here. No, the reason why your material conditions suck is because of assholes like Jay Green who work for these think tanks and are politically aligned with the ruling class and with the 1%. Yet that push is quickly run up against alarm on Capitol Hill, as well as in health and medical circles nationwide that have long viewed the federal government and academia as close partners in advancing the country's scientific research priorities. This is another thing. If you're a college professor, you're not just like some hippie libtard. You are beholden to do research. And you have to study. You have to come up with fucking theses and hypotheses and try to prove your hypotheses. It's just about generating data and interpreting that data. The, quote, indirect costs within the NIH grants help pay for facilities and other operations tied to research that support the arrangement, that supporters of the arrangement say are crucial to running laboratories and conducting promising yet expensive experiments that would not otherwise be done by the private sector. Exactly. That's capitalism. If a company does not think they can turn a profit this quarter, they're not going to go out and do research. They're not going to go out and try to do something groundbreaking because it's risky. And while some academics privately acknowledge that the NIH could rein in some of its funding for wealthier institutions, yeah, that's awesome, actually. I agree with that. Harvard and Yale and other prominent private institutions maybe don't need as much federal funding when their endowment is like $150 billion or whatever the fuck it may be. Yeah, maybe you could rearrange some funds to go to state and local institutions. They cautioned that the across-the-board cut would only end up hurting public universities and smaller schools with less financial cushion, some of these being in red states and rural areas. Quote, it's such a money loser at that level that basically most places are just going to go out of business of doing research, said one university official involved in the frantic discussions playing out across academia over the last few days who was granted anonymity. Universities in conservative strongholds have spent the last few days warning of the drastic economic and scientific toll of the new funding limit, putting fresh pressure on Republican officials to stand up for their states. The episode could also amplify scrutiny of Trump's pick to run the Department of Education, Linda McMahon, ahead of her confirmation hearing on Thursday. Senator Susan Collins slammed the policy as, quote, devastating and illegal. I really don't give a fuck what Susan Collins has to say when she is helping to appoint all of these freaks into Trump's cabinet. She can get fucked. I don't care. Quote, a small targeted approach is needed in order to not hinder life-saving groundbreaking research at high-achieving institutions like those in Alabama. Close Trump ally Senator Katie Britt told Alabama.com, sounding a rare note of skepticism about the administration's agenda. I did just mention that UAB is the second largest employer in the state of Alabama. The state. In Texas, UT Southwest Medical Center estimated it stands to lose more than $100 million annually. Here's UAB mentioned. A spokesperson for the University of Alabama, Birmingham, told Political that the move would, quote, result in job and economic losses across the city. The University of Kentucky dispatched officials to Washington to plead with its congressional delegation to avert tens of millions of dollars in cost. On Monday, higher education groups joined an associate of public universities with schools and states that supported Trump in last year's election to file their own legal challenge that described $65 million in losses for the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a 70% reduction in funding for the University of Florida. These are big-time schools. These are well-known institutions that are worried about this. And again, what's the commonality here? Kentucky, Trump country. Texas, Trump country. Florida, Trump country. Wisconsin, Trump country, although albeit not as much as the other states. Quote, these dangerous proposed cuts are indiscriminate and without purpose, said Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, one of the 22 Democratic AGs who filed a separate lawsuit this week to halt the policy. Quote, this is equally bad for everybody in this country. I agree. This fucks over so many people. This fucks over a tremendous amount of regular ass Americans. It's such a shame. The planned funding cut mirrors efforts elsewhere in the government, a crusade led by Musk that's already gutted U.S. aid and prompted a bid to shutter the CFPB. Quote, the voters wanted solutions, one Trump advisor said of the administration's focus on early cost-cutting moves it believes can win most voter support. Except it's not. You guys are delusional. You have no fucking idea of what's going on. You are immensely out of touch. Voters want solutions, not to... They don't want this, like... You're pro-cancer at this point. Like, the voters do not want more cancer. People don't want less healthcare. They want more healthcare. They want socialized medicine. They want more money in their pockets. They want a higher minimum wage. They want the prices of groceries to come down. They don't want rent to be so fucking expensive. They don't want the interest rates on their mortgage to be so fucking expensive. These solutions, quote unquote, that the Trump administration is proposing is courtesy of the hypothetical voters cooked up in the schizophrenic minds of the people in Trump's administration. The controversy is likely to be further elevated during McMahon's confirmation hearing later this week, where lawmakers were already expected to press Trump's education nominee on the president's pending order to dismantle the Department of Education, Musk's access to sensitive agency data, and the billionaire's latest move to halt hundreds of millions of dollars in government education research contracts. Within McMahon's camp, allies are bracing for the rush of headlines to spark aggressive lines of questioning from Democrats on the education panel. Quote, I don't have any doubt she's going to get the votes. I don't have any doubt she's going to answer the questions from the very hostile Democrats on the committee well. But the passion of this hearing just went up tenfold, said one person familiar with McMahon's confirmation planning who was granted anonymity to speak candidly about the situation. Quote, there will be much more noise around the hearing than there would have been a week ago. The uproar is unlikely to deter Trump and Musk, who have pressed ahead on their spending cut offensive despite the growing legal setbacks. Yet, on this front at least, the administration will need to contend with a dug-in opposition that spans nearly the length of the political spectrum. Quote, people understand the impact of NIH-funded research on jobs and the impact of science on people's well-being, said Elena Fuentes Affleck? Yeah. Chief Scientific Officer of the Association of American Medical Colleges. This has been received as a very significant threat. Disastrous. More government I don't want to say government intervene. More government interaction that people may not know that they have. And Elon Musk and Donald Trump just want to get rid of it because they think that colleges are woke. They think that education is woke.